It is May of 1718, and Charlestown Harbor is bustling with merchant vessels laden with goods from distant lands, its waters teeming. This southern port in the colony of South Carolina is an important trade hub and a gateway for inland trade. In the early morning hours, the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the harbor. A dockworker spots an ominous silhouette, a colossal black ship christened the Queen Anne's Revenge. It was a vessel that had once been a French slaver, but had been converted into a pirate flagship, armed to the teeth with cannons and manned by a ruthless crew. At its masthead flew the infamous black flag, adorned with a white skeleton and an hourglass, signifying that time was running out for those who encountered it. This ship is commanded by Blackbeard, known as Edward Teach to some, a name that struck fear into the hearts of sailors far and wide. His reputation for brutality and cunning had made him a legend, with his fearsome black beard intertwined, it was said, with slow-burning fuses, and a penchant for intimidation. He embodied the very essence of piracy. The infamous pirate Blackbeard has chosen to make his presence felt in this prosperous city and blockade the harbor of Charlestown. The blockade strategy was simple but effective. Blackbeard positioned his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, at the harbor's entrance, its cannons menacingly aimed outward. Joining it is the Adventure, another ship under his command, equally formidable in its armament. Together, they form an impenetrable barrier that cuts off all access to and from Charlestown Harbor. The blockade went on for days and felt like an eternity. Blackbeard's fleet has Charlestown as hostage. No ships can come or go, and the city's lifeline to the outside world is severed. Panic rippled through the city's residents as their supplies dwindled and their livelihoods hung in the balance. The heart of the blockade lay in Blackbeard's demands. He seeks a hefty ransom, a chest filled with valuable medicines, an assortment of desperately needed medical supplies, and a substantial sum of money. Blackbeard needs the medicine for the many cases of sexually transmitted diseases his men have acquired while at sea. The authorities of Charlestown have little choice but to comply. Representatives are dispatched to negotiate with Blackbeard's emissaries, and the terms are reluctantly agreed upon. The city pays a high price to regain its freedom. As the agreed-upon ransom is delivered to Blackbeard's crew, the blockade is lifted. The Queen Anne's Revenge and the Adventure depart Charlestown Harbor, their ominous presence gradually fading into the horizon. Charlestown is spared the devastation that had been looming, but the memory of Blackbeard's blockade would linger as a chilling reminder of the power and terror that notorious pirates could wield during an era defined by lawlessness on the high seas. The story of Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge, today on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Captain Marrow. He is a pirate historian, living the lifestyle of all things pirates, and we're going to talk today about the story of Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge. Captain Marrow, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk some more about pirates. I don't do this enough.
It's always fun to talk about pirates.
Yeah.
So, first of all, you are, like I said, a pirate historian, pirate enthusiast. So what is your background? Tell us a little bit about the things you're involved in.
I've always been interested in pirate stuff ever since a young age. I was born in 1990, so I was kind of at the right age range for stuff coming out. Lego Pirates and Muppets Treasure Island and all the 90s stuff, Cutthroat Island, all that. So I had moved down to Charleston back in 2006. And for the most part, I didn't really find too much about the area that really intrigued me. I'd always been interested in pirate history growing up as a child, and I occasionally looked into it every now and then. I was actually homeschooled. So one of the things that I was able to do growing up was, while there was a curriculum to fulfill each year before being able to legally graduate to the next grade, there was a lot of openness and being able to learn what I wanted to learn as I was being schooled. So more often than not, every time that the topic of like being able to learn about pirates or naval history and stuff, I always grabbed it. But eventually everything changed for me around 2018. So I started really digging into Charleston's pirate history. I started traveling around that point in time as well, up and down the coast to different pirate relevant sites. And I had seen people, again, relevant to Sea of Thieves, who had been doing like cosplay costumes, going to conventions and such. And I was like, that would be fun and all, but I want something a bit more realistic. And that was also the first time that I noticed people do reenacting of other things other than just Revolutionary War and Civil War. So I kind of got wrapped up in all the pirate reenacting, all the pirate history. I started traveling up and down the coast. So really that ended up being the direction I started going. So since then, so for about maybe 5 years now, 4.5, 5 years, I've been running the Shipwrecked with Captain Marrow history page on Facebook. Nowadays, I am completely busy doing pirate stuff like all the time.
I did happen across your profile on Facebook, and your content is really interesting. It's right up my alley. The history of ships and the people involved in ships and pirates. But in addition to what you're writing online on social media, you've also written a book, and that's coming out soon.
So my book is titled Pirate Ghosts and Buried Treasures of the Southeast Coast, a historical assessment on pirate folklore. It initially started off as just like a little personal project. Like I have a catalog of stuff for myself initially. Because in addition to all the history, I've also always been interested in all the folklore, all the stuff about ghost ships, pirate ghost stories, buried treasure legends, all that stuff. And in addition to all the local history around me, I wanted to also make a compilation of that stuff. And what really started off as like a personal document turned into, a 30-page document, and then a 60-page document, then a 100-page document, and it kept going. I'm like, okay, I basically am writing a book at this point. Got it. And I started leaning into it because one of the things I heard recommended pretty early on when I started looking into the premise of actually making a book is you're supposed to analyze your own collection. You're supposed to analyze your own library of things and think to yourself, like, what don't I have on the shelf? And then when you can't find it, you look it up online. And if it doesn't exist for you to buy, maybe it's time to write it. Maybe you'll be that person to fill that void. So the book is like a compilation of all the pirate folklore tales from Florida up to Virginia. It starts over in the Florida's like Pensacola area off to the west, and then it just wraps around and goes all the way up to Virginia. One of the plans was that it was going to be for the entire eastern seaboard, all the way up to Nova Scotia and whatnot, but ended up being way too much. So I broke it up into 2 volumes. So volume 1 is finally coming out next Tuesday on the 19th, which is also Talk Like a Pirate Day, which was a deliberate decision, not a coincidence. And the second volume is already over halfway done, and it goes from Maryland up to Canada's Newfoundland.
And that's September of 2023. So by the time you hear this, this book will actually be out and available for purchase on Amazon.
Yes.
We are specifically talking today about Blackbeard. It's kind of an intriguing figure, of course, because there's so much there. There's so many stories. There's so much legend. And yet we really don't know for sure a whole lot about him other than perhaps some recorded history. But other than that, it's a lot of speculation, wouldn't you say?
Yes, definitely. Especially when it comes to the man's name. So for the sake of my own sanity, when writing my own book, I just continually refer to the man as Blackbeard because it's the easiest way to go about it. One of the most commonly used name for the man is Edward Teach. However, his last name does have a variety of spellings and pronunciations. He is spelled as what looks like the word thatch pretty often, as you would see like a thatched roof. However, it should be noted that that first H is actually silent, and it would be pronounced tatch, which is how you also have other spellings, Tache. So it's teach, tatch, tetch, sometimes with an E in there. Edward seems to be like the main first name that people usually go to. I believe at one point in time, he's also known as William Drummond. And I believe that was supposed to be like an alias that he used for a period of time off the coast of North Carolina. But again, for simplicity's sake, the man's name is Blackbeard. And for that matter, as for the man's origins, there's a few different conflicting theories, especially depending on which historian you decide to try to look into or adhere by. I don't necessarily have a theory that is my personal belief. I just kind of, stay on top of what all these different concepts potentially are. One of them, and the most common one, is the fact that he was from Bristol, England. Another claim is that he originates from Jamaica. And one of the most recent claims that a historian named Kevin Duffus recently wrote about, I say recently, but I guess it was 2008. He published a book called The Last Days of Blackbeard the Pirate. And in his book, that entire claim is that the man's name is actually Edward Beard of the Beard family. He believes his name was Edward Beard, and Black is added in as a descriptor, like Black Sam Bellamy or Black Bart Roberts. Black gets added in because of his association with piracy. Because historically, there was a Beard family that lived in North Carolina in the town of Bath, adjacent to the governor's house, the governor of whom Blackbeard would later on be highly associated with for being an accomplice with. And there was also some of those family members, the Beard family, that moved down here to South Carolina, where I'm at, not far from me in a town called Goose Creek. And his entire theory is that Blackbeard was originally born in Goose Creek, South Carolina. Again, he has an entire book on the premise. It's very interesting. I'm not sure if I entirely buy it, but it's one of the three, I guess, main theories about Blackbeard and where he's from. Bottom line is, who knows? There's a lot of speculation surrounding him.
And those theories vary pretty widely from Bristol, England,
yes,
to Jamaica to South Carolina. That tells you right there that there's probably no hard evidence that's indicating that he's from any one of those places.
Most of the hard evidence that we have typically pops up after he's already turned to piracy, because everything that he did is very clearly documented. But prior to that, as for where he came from, that's all speculation.
Part of his origin story, as I understand it too, is that his father's name potentially was also Edward Teach, and that his childhood was perhaps not the best, not exactly a loving father. Do you have any additional information about those that background, or at least that theory?
I have heard the whole his father being named the same as well. And again, I know that in Kevin Duffus's book, The Last Days of Blackbeard the Pirate, while he does go on to extrapolate on his concept of him originating from South Carolina, part of the book does address the author having actually gone over to Bristol, England, and trying to figure out where the Beard family came from. And I believe that was still mixed in there somewhere. In one of the more recent pirate series that came out, specifically one called Our Flag Means Death, the pirate comedy series that debuted last year, they actually go ahead with that premise that Blackbeard had an abusive father, like that's worked into the show as well. So it's definitely a thing that's becoming more popularized.
Now, later in his maybe early adult years or late teens, he actually joined the Royal Navy, which is something that's, or at least it's speculated he joined the Royal Navy.
A lot of pirates typically come from at least a sailor background, but a number of them from naval background. Other famous pirates such as Henry Every, he was a member of the Royal Navy as well before he led his men to mutiny in the Spanish port of, I believe it's called Corunna. I'm probably butchering the name there, but it's spelled Corunna. But a lot of pirates typically do have at least a sailor background, so it's not too surprising. When it comes to pirates as ex-Navy sailors, when it came to life on a naval ship, it wasn't necessarily, a fun time. Very strict rules, very harsh punishments. Uh, a lot of pay was very, very sparse. Sometimes pay would be promised and wouldn't come in for a very long time period. So it wasn't necessarily a great condition to live at sea aboard a Navy ship. So a lot of the times when you have pirates who used to be Navy sailors, that was their chance to finally, mutiny, overthrow, establish their own rules for an easier life. I mean, a life of crime, and probably not a good ending in the long run, but is a little bit better, is living in the here and now.
And what a lot of people don't realize is how democratic and fair pirates were with each other, as far as sharing the plunder equally, and everybody had a voice. They really operated those ships like a true brotherhood, and they bonded that way. And conditions most often were better than on a Navy ship.
Yeah, and it was really interesting the way that captains were typically elected as well, rather than a person just being forcing their way into that role. There was always the possibility of deposing the captain, the crew voting him out of command and voting in a new commander. From my understanding, that was one of the first examples of stuff like that happening. I mean, I'm sure that there were other criminal bands that existed throughout time that probably did something like that, maybe, but I know it's very much so popularized by pirates.
We have Blackbeard or Edward Teach, perhaps. How does he get into the lifestyle of piracy?
From my understanding, the first mention of Blackbeard entering history as a pirate happens in 1716, and he's noted as being a member of Captain Benjamin Hornigold's crew, who was another pirate operating out of Nassau at the time. So when he first enters history as a pirate, I guess he would have been in his mid to late 30s. So there's a whole time period of who knows what this man was doing that led up to this point. I believe it's also only speculated as to how he became associated with Benjamin Hornigold as well, because Benjamin Hornigold was a member of the Flying Gang, which was a number of pirates operating out of Nassau in the aftermath of Queen Anne's War, or the War of Spanish Succession. But as for how he came to be with him, I mean, it can only be speculated that at some point in time, Blackbeard came to Nassau, met him there, I suppose, and started working with him.
And when did Blackbeard actually acquire his own ship, his first captaincy?
I know at some point in time, within 7 months, I want to say, of his first mentioning of being with Benjamin Hornigold, he's noted as the captain of the Adventure, his own sloop. I assume that he acquired the Adventure through, interactions with Hornigold. It was probably a prize ship that they had captured at some point. He had the Adventure, and he would eventually break off from Hornigold's fleet to go off and kind of start his own career. And that's when he would come across Stede Bonnet and Nassau and go off and do his pirate stuff.
Now, the story between Blackbeard and Bonnet it's a pretty interesting story. Basically, Blackbeard was so smooth, he was able to convince Bonnet to give him his ship. If I understand the speculation anyway.
Yes. Right. So that is definitely a thing that did happen. As far as I know, that is not speculative. So Stede Bonnet, originally raised on Barbados, he was known as the gentleman pirate. He's always kind of an oddity in pirate history, which is why so many people have focused on him, at least in recent years, with the publications of a number of history books, as well as that new series, Our Flagmate's Death. So essentially, as far as we know, he ran away from Barbados, potentially as a midlife crisis. He was a unique figure in the fact that he would pay his own crew weekly wages rather than just divvying plunder. He commissioned for his own ship to be built, and he kind of went off with no sailing experience. All the rest of his crew were all experienced sailors that he rounded up from Barbados, but he himself had never been at sea before. So it wasn't too long before he found himself kind of limping into Nassau, to the pirate haven, because he had recently gotten into a scuffle with a Spanish man-of-war that almost destroyed his ship, the Revenge. And when he arrives to Nassau, he meets Blackbeard there, a character that he had heard of before. So he meets Blackbeard there, and Blackbeard kind of does take him under the wing sort of deal. Blackbeard had been doing it for speculatively many years. So he at least knew what he was doing as a captain. Essentially, yes, he did talk Stede Bonnet into basically giving control of his ship over to him. Stede Bonnet was not really delegated to the role of a sailor. Some people compare it to that he was a willing hostage aboard his own ship, because he didn't necessarily do anything at that point. He wasn't calling the shots, and he wasn't really doing any traditional sailor roles to help out. He was kind of just a guest on his own ship. And it would remain that way for a good while.
So we have Blackbeard now with the adventure, and he's going to go in seek of plunder for him and his men. So what kind of shenanigans does he get into of note when he begins to really become the notorious character that we know?
So he sets off with the adventure and the revenge. I believe at some point in time, very early on afterwards, they acquire another sloop to add to their fleet. But typically they go up and down the eastern seaboard as far north as the Delaware, along the way hitting all manner of merchant ships. When it came to pirates, especially during this time period, typically they targeted merchant vessels. They didn't really go after all the big Spanish galleons that were hoarding gold that was being transported back over to Spain. So really what they did was they were harassing shipping and trade all along the American colonies. He had some interactions down in the Caribbean as well. He sacks a ship called the Protestant Caesar, which is not too far off the coast of Honduras. And immediately following that attack is the first time that a man named Black Caesar is noted as being a member of his crew as well. And Black Caesar is a name that will pop up a whole bunch later on down the road. However, a lot of that has to do with Florida folklore. But this was the first time that Black Caesar becomes noted as a member of the crew. So after sacking the Protestant Caesar, again, Blackbeard goes out, plunders a few more ships, and then eventually he comes across one called the La Concorde. So the La Concorde was a French slaver vessel that had departed from West Africa. And currently her hold was full of, I want to say, upwards of 200 enslaved Africans bound for the Caribbean. After their long Atlantic journey, a majority of those on board who were the actual able-bodied sailors, a lot of them were suffering from sickness. Actually, a number of them had actually perished since leaving West Africa, as did a number of the enslaved shackled down below. So when Blackbeard shows up with his collection of sloops and he raises the black, they pretty much just surrendered to him. There wasn't even a fight. So at that point in time, he takes over the La Concorde and he decides to make that his primary warship. That is his capital ship now, which he would quickly rename the Queen Anne's Revenge.
Despite taking over that slave ship, he was not, as far as I know, directly involved with the slave trade.
That is correct. However, he's not the humanitarian sometimes that people like to make him out to be. So pirates in general weren't what a lot of people are trying to make them out to be in recent years. So when it comes down to it, when he did take over this slaver vessel, he did allow most of them to become members of his crew, because when you have a vessel that large, you really do need an overwhelming amount of people to control such a thing. That being said, that's not to say that afterwards he did sell a number of them. He still viewed them as lower class sailors. He still viewed them as cargo when he needed to. He had some which were, as far as other people were concerned, trusted crewmates that later on in North Carolina, he would also later on go to sell despite that. It wasn't like a primary thing. He wasn't directly involved in the slave trade, like you said, but he did play a role in what was going on during the time period.
So as he's making a name for himself up and down the mid-Atlantic coast there, especially in the Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina areas, what were some of his deeds or misdeeds that really made him such a notorious figure? and feared.
It would be incorrect to not mention his blockade of the Charlestown Harbor, which some people consider to be his most, I don't want to say showboaty thing that he ever did, but it was a very huge deal. So essentially what happened is in May of 1718, the Queen Anne's Revenge, along with the Adventure and the Revenge, they all arrived to the Charlestown Harbor, and he enacts what is a 7-day long blockade of the harbor. During that point in time, a number of vessels attempting to both leave and enter are captured by him. I want to say it's about 13 ships total. Basically, he causes a huge problem for the town of Charleston. As for the reason why he's there, he shows up and he's in demand of medicine. Of all the things that he could be doing, he is specifically requesting medicine. He arrives into the Charlestown Harbor demanding medicine, and it's believed that he and his men were suffering from a multitude of sexually transmitted diseases that they had picked up, likely from their time down in the Caribbean. Because some of the stuff that would be later found aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge from the shipwreck not far from current-day Beaufort, North Carolina, one of the most famous shipwreck artifacts discovered there is actually a metal urethral syringe, which would have been used during the time period to pump mercury into the urethra, which was a practice at the time that they believed would cure or at least help you start recovering from syphilis. But we know now from modern science that it actually doesn't help. The mercury is thought to act as an anesthesia for the suffering sailors. So essentially, Blackbeard made a proposal to the town of Charleston, which at the time would have been called Charlestown. And his demand was a 400-pound chest of medicine. And if his demands were not met, he threatened that he would level the city with cannon fire. For a whole entire 7-day period, he and his men kind of loomed off in the harbor, interrupting trade, while town officials frantically tried to figure out what they were going to do about this. He had sent a pilot captain who had came out to greet the Queen Anne's Revenge when it first arrived, not knowing that they were pirates. He had sent the pilot captain back into town along with the pirates' demand, along with, I believe, 6 other of his crew. And during his time period here in Charleston, Blackbeard technically never left the ship. He never actually set foot in Charleston. 6 of his crew members did. And in the end, Charlestown was forced to cave to his demands, which didn't look good for the English port. It made them seem weak, which was like a big concern about actually, submitting to his demand. Was in the aftermath, because of Blackbeard having done that, more pirates would show up later afterwards, hearing that, you can do whatever you want with Charlestown. They caved to the pirates' demands. They just caved to Blackbeard. So following Blackbeard's blockade of Charlestown, there would be a number of other pirates interacting with the harbor.
The king wouldn't have been so thrilled about pirates just going about pillaging British merchant ships and Royal Navy ships and other colonial ships, which were all part of his empire as well. So ultimately, we know that Blackbeard met his demise. So let's talk about that. What led up to Queen Anne's Revenge sinking and the end of Blackbeard?
So immediately following his blockade of the Charlestown Harbor, he would travel north up along the North Carolina coast. The plan was that he was actually going to be careening the Queen Anne's Revenge, cleaning, scraping the hull, removing ship worms and barnacle and algae growth, everything that you would need to help you actually maneuver better at sea and, ships a little bit faster once it's all nice and cleaned. However, what he wasn't counting on was a sandbar. So sandbars, of course, they come and go as hurricanes and storms reshape the coastline ever so slightly. Sometimes what gets reshaped is what you can't see, and sometimes that is a sandbar. So at the time, the location would have been known as Topsail Inlet. Nowadays, we have a Topsail Island, not far beyond the Cape Fear River, but Topsail Inlet would have been further up north. Nowadays, we call it the Beaufort Inlet. And at that point in time, the town of Beaufort, really, it was more of a small fishing village. but it did exist. It was still noted as Beaufort. As Blackbeard arrives into the harbor, the Queen's Revenge runs aground, and before he can actually ask for assistance, their other ship runs aground on another sandbar, damaging her hull as well. At the time, there would have been Queen Anne's Revenge, there would have been the Revenge, the Adventure, and they had a third sloop as well that they had captured off of Havana. So, this was a huge shakeup in Blackbeard's plans. Some people say he even did this intentionally, although I'm not really sure if that's a smart decision. One of the speculative reasons is that he wanted to downsize his crew. When you downsize the crew and then you divvy up the goods, mathematically, everyone gets a better share, as long as you ditch half these people. Coincidentally, the Queen's Revenge and their other, as far as I know, unnamed sloop ran aground over there in the Topsail Inlet, and immediately they started transferring everything over to the Adventure, which Blackbeard would also transfer over to as well. And the people of Beaufort, they basically had these two pirate ships that were dropped off and left on their doorstep. Blackbeard did transfer over everything probably that was valuable, especially all of the gold and silver they had on board, likely other treasure as well. But a number of things were left behind. Cannons, the ship's anchor, the ship's bell, all stuff that later on archaeologists would discover out there in the harbor. But largely they would transfer over to the Adventure. He would also, around this time, part ways with Stede Bonnet. Bonnet had actually departed from the rest of the ships to go acquire a pardon for both him and Blackbeard. And during this time period, his crew of the Revenge would actually be marooned on a small island. And when Stede Bonnet returns with paperwork in hand saying that they had been pardoned by the king, which was a pardon that he had went to acquire from the governor, he had found out that his men had been left behind. And while the Revenge was not taken, Blackbeard and his loyal crew left solely on the Adventure. The Revenge had been left without its sails, without its cannons, and he and his rescued crew would basically have to start again from scratch. He actually had the ability with the paperwork in hand that he and his crew could, call it quits and step out of the game, but a lot of people just assume that that's the point in time when something finally awoken in him where, he wanted revenge. He goes out and continues being a pirate, despite the fact that he was ready to call it quits. He was betrayed by his close friend, Edward Teach or Blackbeard, and I think he was just very angry at what had been done to him. So it was his attempt to get back at the world, which ultimately would be Stede Bonnet and their crew's demise as well. Like they should have called it quits, but he let his, anger get the best of him.
And like other pirates that have a short career, Blackbeard's would come to an end. What were the details of his demise?
So he and his men would travel up along the Outer Banks out to the island of Ocracoke, where they would party for a 3 or 4 day period. But also, Blackbeard would travel inward to Bath. He would go across the Pamlico Sound and up the river to the small Bath town, is what it was called at the time. At the time, there was also a governor proceeding over it, and he actually went over and accepted the pardon. He decided the fact that he was a changed man. He had gone through and, I guess, accomplished enough. He and his men had talked it over, the premise of becoming free men once again. However, after arriving back to Ocracoke with a pardon, the piracy didn't necessarily stop. They just tried to do some stuff that didn't get too big on the radar, essentially. Not too long afterwards, they came across a French ship called the Rose Emily. He would return with the ship along with an amount of cargo. And the long story short is, after he had been questioned, hey, Blackbeard, where all this cargo come from? He would kind of buy his freedom by colluding with the governor of Bathtown. So the piracy didn't necessarily end. He just, again, tried to keep it on the down low. However, the continued acts of piracy, word would eventually spread up to Virginia, where Governor Spotswood, Alexander Spotswood, he would send out Lieutenant Robert Maynard to go deal with Blackbeard, who he knew had been operating off of Ocracoke. There's a whole bunch of legal jargon associated with this whole entire process going on. Governor Spotswood didn't have jurisdiction over doing something like that down in the North Carolina territory. So there was a whole entire premise that what the governor and Lieutenant Robert Maynard did coming down and assaulting Blackbeard was unlawful. At the time, he had accepted the pardon, even though we know now that he was continuing to have done piracy. At the time, he had sent a naval officer down to kill a pardoned man. So at one point in time, while Blackbeard would be aboard the Adventure, he would note a small sloop arriving in the distance. Thinking it to be a merchant ship, he didn't really have too much concern about it. So early in the morning, it would be revealed to Blackbeard that the ship was not that of a merchantman after all, but instead was a ship captained by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of Virginia, along with a number of sailors who were of provincial navy from out of Virginia. They were militiamen who had signed on to go hunt down Blackbeard, essentially. A lot of them had signed on to doing so willingly. So it was an entire fervent crew that was bound and determined to finally put an end to the scourge that was Blackbeard. The battle lasts for a good number of hours before finally the ships kind of pull in on each other, where they board the other ship. Blackbeard and his men they go over the gunwales onto Maynard's ship. However, he's unaware of how many people are crammed down below. So this is also a tactic that pirates typically used as well. A good number of merchant ships would also fall prey to pirate vessels, unaware of how many crew that they had crammed down below decks. When the ship would finally come into a nice close distance, typically pirates would swarm up from below. And all pirate ships were just overloaded with crew. Typically, if a ship was traditionally manned by about maybe 30 sailors or so, it wouldn't be uncommon for the pirates to instead try to cram on 50 or 60 people. The whole entire name of the game was overpowering the other crew. So this is exactly what Blackbeard falls prey to when him and his men board Maynard's ship. A whole slew of men under Maynard's control rush up from below decks, and Blackbeard and his men are overwhelmed. He is reportedly cut 13 times, shot several times before going down. I'm not sure how much of this is, played up for flair for his legend. I imagine that it's definitely an exaggeration. It's definitely played up as a very epic battle.
Well, it makes for good political fodder.
It does.
After the siege of Charlestown, there were people that were really wanting his head, which ultimately they get.
Yep, he was literally beheaded on the deck, which Maynard would afterwards affix to his bowsprit as a gruesome trophy, which he would use to sail into Bath Town and then later on back up to Virginia. Also, whenever his head was chopped off, his body was chucked overboard, and according to folklore and legends, reportedly swam around the ship multiple times looking for his head before sinking to the depths.
Interesting made-up fact.
Yes. So Robert Maynard would travel into Bath Town with Blackbeard's severed head prominently displayed, and he would wrangle up a number of ex-pirates who had once served on Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge. After the ship had been run aground in the inlet, some of them didn't transfer over to the Adventure, but instead decided to settle down in Bath.
There have been countless books and stories and movies and folklore about Blackbeard. What are some of your favorite, perhaps, we'll say legends or myths about what Blackbeard was or things that he did?
So one of the most famous things about Blackbeard is a quote which arises from the 1724 General History of the Pirates by the author Charles Johnson, which is a presumed pseudonym of a man named Nathaniel Mist, who was writing for the newspapers at the time, or was potentially the author Daniel Defoe. In this book, it is claimed that according to crew members of Blackbeard's, he had made a statement at one point in time about the whereabouts of his treasure. He was questioned as to what he did with it, if he told his wife where he had buried it. And Blackbeard's like legendary statement in reply is, only myself and the devil know where the treasure is, and the longer liver will be the one who reclaims it. Something like that. So that spawned kind of one of the strong associations with pirates and buried treasure. Historically, there was a pirate who buried treasure, which is William Kidd. Historically, he did bury treasure on Gardiner's Island up near New York. The treasure was found afterwards and was part of his court case before his execution in London. However, combination of that and Blackbeard's supposed claims are really the two strong ties as for what a lot of that folklore stems from. So with Blackbeard, there are countless stories up and down along the coast. Some of them are outrageous. Some of them are fun. A lot of them involves Blackbeard's wives. So historically, the man was known to be married. Depending on which research you look into or what you decide to subscribe to, he was married as many as 16 times to 16 different women. It probably wasn't that many. I can see multiple, maybe 6 or 7. I think it is I believe it is exaggerated. But a lot of the folklore tales surrounding Blackbeard involve him burying treasure and then leaving one of his wives there to watch over it. That doesn't take place just down here in the southeast coast, but that extends up to the New England area as well. Like if you were to believe every folklore tale surrounding Blackbeard, like the man just left wives laying around everywhere, guarding supposed treasure.
That's good for tourism.
Yeah. So one of the more ridiculous ones, which regards Blackbeard having a girlfriend. I don't recall what her supposed name is. I assure you that she's fictional. The two of them supposedly loved spending time in Charleston, and they would spend many nights hand in hand visiting all the various taverns and bars in town. And it was his favorite place to bury treasure too, just outside of town in the marsh. So he takes her aboard. They go off and do pirate stuff together. She gets promoted to being a captain herself. And then whenever she accumulates some treasure, she's like, hey, I want to bury treasure out where you bury treasure. So then he takes her out in the swamp and she buries treasure too. And then they part ways. Blackbeard gets killed off an Ocracoke, and then she knows that it's not safe to return back to Charleston. So supposedly, out in the marshes, just outside of Charleston, is Blackbeard's treasure and also Blackbeard's girlfriend's treasure. That's one of the more far-fetched ones. Dates are especially wrong in that one, because the claim stems from stating that all that happened like around 1680 or something, which is 38 years before Blackbeard would ever even be mentioned in history. It would mean that if he died at age 40 or even 38, he would have been 0 years old or 2 years old.
Well, what's the saying? Why let the truth get in the way of a good story?
Yeah. And that's what a lot of folklore stems from. A lot of it stems from tourism. A lot of times a place will have no pirate history, but then all of a sudden, if a beach town becomes more of a booming tourism place, like all of a sudden, yeah, they had pirate history, all right. And the tour guides are excited to tell you about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when it comes down to it, tour guides are typically tipped by people who signed on to their tours that were impressed with what they were told. They don't really care if it was true or not. So it kind of, over the years, has led up to a situation where, you know, the more fanciful tale that you tell, the better chance is that you get tips. But then those people go home and they tell their family members about how they went on this cool tour and how they learned about Blackbeard and how he buried treasure over here and over here. And like, they don't know it's not true. And then, you know, they told the family members, and those family member tells a guy at the bar, and that's how folklore gets started.
Something about Blackbeard that gets talked about quite frequently is the lit fuses he would put in his beard, so he would look even more terrifying as he was approaching his enemies. Is that just imagination of writers and authors down the road, Or is that based in any kind of fact?
So it is believed to be a fact of a thing that he supposedly did one time. So when it comes down to that scenario happening, it's only ever written about in, again, 1724's A General History of the Pirates. It mentions a specific scenario in which he supposedly does that to make himself look more menacing. Although it's only noted that he did it the one time. It's not a thing that he went off and did every single time they came across a ship. And again, supposedly he did this. The book A General History of the Pirates by Charles Johnson / Nathaniel Mist / Daniel Defoe is a work that is heavily criticized by the history community because the author, like nowadays, it's much more easy to research history with the internet and being able to access all these different archives and everything. And people didn't notice it, back in the day when this man publishes this book, but like there's a lot wrong in that book, which is understandable. I mean, he was more limited with the resources they had to work with. A lot of the book is written by supposedly interviews that he was able to have with actual pirates from that time period that were in prison before him, and having access to newspapers that had come out last week. But the problem was newspapers were infrequent. Sometimes they were incorrect as well. The rate at which information traveled along that time period was abysmal. Typically something would happen and, England might not get word of it for 7 months. So bottom line is, a lot of what is written in the book, while a lot of it is actual historic fact and is something that, it shouldn't be dismissed necessarily, there is a good cluster of things that you can look up nowadays and easily come across the realization that, yep, he was wrong about that. He was wrong about that. That date's wrong. He wrote about this guy, but he probably meant this other pirate. Like there's a lot of confusion in it. And then it gets worse because his book becomes a bestseller. And afterwards, I believe 2 years later, he publishes a second edition where he adds even more pirates into it. And it's supposed to be like this is a history of all the pirates that have been happening over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And he adds in more pirates into his compilation. But in the second book, he seems to really start putting some more fancifulness into it as well. So the second edition of the book actually includes some pirates that, from everything that historians nowadays can tell through research, don't exist. Like he made up some pirates to put in there as well. And there was definitely a handful of things that he did where he over elaborated on actual historic events and actual historic facts, where he would spice it up a little bit for the reader.
I'm picturing a very joking Blackbeard at some point saying, "Hey, y'all, check this out." And you put him in there, and it was just a lark he did one time. The actual Queen Anne's Revenge, the wreck, was discovered in 1996 and has been protected, and archaeological missions from the North Carolina Department of Cultural Resources have been bringing up some objects for archaeological study. And it's quite interesting that it's really one of the only legitimate, verified pirate wrecks that we've been able to, that human beings have actually been able to research. And
yeah, there's the Queen Anne's Revenge, and there's also the Widow shipwreck up off of Cape Cod for Black Sam Bellamy. But yes, in North Carolina, in Beaufort, they have the North Carolina Maritime Museum right there, which houses all the artifacts that they've pulled up from the Queen Anne's Revenge. It's also where they have the lab as well for study and, cleaning up the concretions and all of that stuff. I know that there's a good number of things that they've discovered from the Queen Anne's Revenge. I know there's multiple cannons. There's a French sword, which they believe might have belonged to Blackbeard, potentially. I know there's like a handle for a dirk, which is like a small dagger, and plenty of other artifacts. I believe there's 2,000 or 3,000 some artifacts that have been discovered, which sounds like a lot, but I mean, some of that are like nails and lead shot, like all individual. Like they catalog everything.
And I know the Queen Anne's Revenge is actually a legitimate archaeological research site being done, scientifically being excavated.
In 2019, I went up to visit. They were having the Beaufort pirate invasion at the time. The town has a big annual festival consisting of pirate reenactors and pirate performers and entertainers and vendors and so on. And while I was there, I checked out the Maritime Museum, checked out all the artifacts that they had on display. And then also, just for the sake of getting as close as I could as, a normal civilian to the shipwreck, I took a ferry out to Shackleford Banks, which is a small little barrier island not far from there that creates the mouth of what is now the Beaufort Inlet. So I went out there, I did like some photos in my pirate kit along the shore, which was as close as you can get out to the shipwreck, because you can't even typically go out to it. It is reserved for, the people actually doing the archaeological survey and whatnot. Like you can get hit with hefty fines just for being in the area above it. People are supposed to avoid that, and that's like a well-known thing in that area. Like if you're on a fishing boat, you're not supposed to be over there fishing directly over top of the Queen Anne's Revenge. Like that is a protected site. I have a book in my library of my huge collection of 60, 70 some pirate history books. It's called Blackbeard's Sunken Prize, the 300-year voyage of Queen Anne's Revenge. And I will recommend the book. The book is really well done. It's full of full color illustrations and photographs of all of the stuff that's been brought up from the Queen Anne's Revenge. It goes very in depth over the whole entire process of them discovering it and how they went from not being quite sure what it is to them finally verifying, okay, this is definitely the Queen Anne's Revenge. And it also goes into that whole entire premise of archaeological versus treasure hunters. They specifically go on to state that treasure hunters are people that want to find something, and then all the archaeologists are people who want to find out about something.
Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it.
Again, it's Blackbeard's Sunken Prize.
I'll check out that book. But also, we'd like everybody to check out your book. So where can everybody find your book? How would they order it?
So my book is titled Pirate Ghosts and Buried Treasures of the Southeast Coast, a historical assessment on pirate folklore. It will be releasing on Amazon come September 19th, 2023. However, you can also get copies directly from me via my Facebook page, Shipwrecked with Captain Marrow. Going about it in that route allows you to get a signed copy, and it also means more of the proceeds typically go to the author rather than the mega corporation. So I'm always for that. But for simplicity's sake, it will be available on Amazon.
Well, thank you, Captain Marrow, for being here and telling us all about Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge and all of the other assorted and associated characters that come along with it. It was a pleasure to meet you, and best of luck with your book.
Thank you. I enjoyed being here with you.
That's going to do it for this episode about Blackbeard and the Queen Anne's Revenge. Thank you so much to Captain Marrow for joining me and sharing his expert knowledge. Captain Marrow's new book, Pirate Ghosts and Buried Treasures of the Southeast Coast, is available on Amazon.com or directly from Captain Marrow via his Facebook page, Shipwrecked with Captain Marrow 2.0. You can follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on social media at ShipwrecksPod and at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow him on YouTube at Sean Secret or on the web at sean.siegfried.se. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, don't forget to wear your life jackets.